right. We're taking all the best old school wisdom and blending it with the top new school methods to bring you the optimal coaching strategies. This is the 80-20 Baseball Podcast with Coach Bo.
Welcome, coaches, parents, and I know there's some players that listen. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our weekly check-in on our path to being great coaches. This podcast is, of course, specifically for youth baseball coaches and baseball coaches of all ages. Although I know there are parents and players that listen to this and get a lot out of it, the more the merrier. In this week's episode, on our path to being great coaches, I came up with a couple labels that we can use for our drill difficulty ratio. I'll share those out in just a minute and how they can help our players and teams. In part two, I'll share out a quote, a mindset, a modus operandi that we can borrow from a well-known business person, but it's something that is so relevant to youth coaching. And in part three today, I will share out a little bit of my experience from coaching, something that was said to myself and the other coach from an opposing coach in our recent game. I'll share with you that. And I was over in the Seattle, Kent, Washington area and Driveline Baseball, a very well-known baseball program business is located in Kent. I got a great tour of their new facility. I toured their old facility a few years back, and I'll share with you my thoughts on this new facility. They had quite a few pictures on the wall, Mookie Betts, other major leaguers, some sweet Polaroids. But as I was leaving, they had a ton of youth baseball players coming in. So I'll share with you my thoughts on the tour of Driveline's new facility. Some of you aren't familiar with Driveline, some of you are, and I'll just get into it briefly next week, my thoughts on that, so it can work and be useful information for everybody, no matter how much you know about the youth baseball or the baseball world or community or not. And we'll go from there. I hope you enjoyed the interview over the last 2 weeks with Coach Sarancic. That guy has coached longer than many of us have been alive. And I'll tell you what, his one-liners are great. They're useful. And the interview, the discussion with Coach Sarancic that played out on the last 2 episodes is one of my favorite that we've done, that we've had on this podcast. One thing, on top of all of Coach Sarancic's knowledge about the game and coaching, specifically coaching youth baseball, I think he has a really great approach to hearing different points of view. So in the interview, there were a few things that came up. I offered a follow-up rebuttal, if you will, or an alternative option to something that he proposed, or an additional option. And I thought he did a great job of trying to be agreeable rather than being contrarian. And in the baseball world, I have found more coaches and people want to pick apart other coaches' methods rather than looking for the good points, looking for the good parts, adding to it, building off of it. So I thought the interview was really smooth. And the reason over the years I have not had too many rebuttals, or there haven't been many times where I've probed the guest. One reason is you have a guest on your show. They're taking the time out of their day, of their busy schedule to come on here and share information with us. And we can take from it what we want. And I agreed with 95% of what Coach Sarancic had to say. There was a little bit I thought there were some variations to it that we needed to address, bring up. And I only do that to help clarify for all of you, the listeners, that might be thinking, I heard this get said by the guest, but maybe that wasn't your experience. So I try to offer a counterpoint if I feel like there's a good chance that a lot of coaches might have seen something different or have seen it played out different. And that's where I'm coming from. But what a great interview. One of my favorite. And I can't wait to have Coach Sarancic back on toward the end of the year. I asked him if he'd come back on for something that we could record in December and put out in January, kicking off 2025. And he's awesome. He just said, yep, I'm in. I already have it on my calendar. So a lot of good stuff there. Now let's dive into part one, the drill difficulty ratio. The drill difficulty ratio, 20-40-40. It's an approximation. I recommend coaches to follow the 20-40-40 drill difficulty ratio. More specifically, 20% of your reps, 20% of your team's reps, the first 20% of your teams of the drill should be progressive in nature. They should progress from about 50% game speed up to about 90 to 95% game speed. Speed is one thing. Other things can be included to make a drill more difficult. like randomness. So for example, I was watching a batting practice video just a little bit ago, Oregon State, and the coach was just piping average fastballs, four seam straight right down the middle. I don't know what the rest of their batting practice looked like. This was before a game. This was a pregame batting practice. I'm hoping that round 2 had more than just fastballs down the middle, because the game that took place a few hours after that batting practice sure as heck wasn't going to just have fastballs right down the middle. The pitchers on the other team were trying to do anything but that. But having your first round of batting practice, just throwing average fastball speed or even a little slower to get their swings going, maybe the first couple pitches a little bit slower than typical game and just normal fastballs down the middle. And then round 2, you rotate some breaking balls in there. Even for teams that are 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, it doesn't hurt to throw in some off-speed pitches, changeups. My point is, make the drill progressively more difficult. So the first 20% should be very progressive in nature, should be designed very progressively, or thought of as a way to on-ramp the player, the players, the team into the game speed segment or part of that drill. And this goes for any drill. I use batting practice there as an example, but this should go for any drill. Now, I've talked about this before, the 20-40-40, but I came up with a couple labels that I'd like to share with you, and they work for me. You can use them if you like, or come up with something different. But instead of saying, all right, this is the slow speed, or this is the medium speed, or this is the easy version of the drill, or this is the easy part of the drill, I thought, why don't we name them something that the players can remember and doesn't have a totally non-hip name? So the first 20%, where you're progressing, you're on-ramping the players in the drill, whether that's the speed of a ground ball, the randomness. So in other words, making the drill more predictable, that's easier. I'd propose we call this first 20% warm-up mode. Now, by labeling these parts, we help to clarify to our players that, for example, in this case, the warm-up speed is not game speed. So we call it warm-up mode. So when you start hitting ground balls at 50, 60% of the typical game, 50 to 60, 70% speed compared to the normal ground ball, the average, the typical ground ball in a game at that level, they know it's warm-up mode. We clearly delineate that the beginning of the drill is not how fast the game is going to be. Now, while the bulkier players can do the math on their own, it doesn't hurt to make it crystal clear that those 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% intensity reps at the beginning of the drill are not the speed of the game for the most part. Of course, there's some weak hits and ground balls that aren't hit that well, of course, in every game and sometimes every inning. And in fact, hitting the ball slow or having a slow roller or a slow chopper in the game or throwing an extra slow curveball in batting practice, even though it's slower, that could actually be at the end of the drill because that can stretch the level of difficulties. So it's not always speed. Another one is how fast can they do the drill. I'm a huge fan of a stopwatch, using a stopwatch. Competitions, we all agree, are really good. Going up against the clock, going up against the stopwatch, to me, is one of the best ways to add competition to your defensive drills, because the other team's runners are giving your defense, will give your defense a finite amount of time to get that out. In fact, you could time the fastest kid in your league with a stopwatch. Maybe they're playing in the game before you. Maybe they're on your team. Stopwatch that kid. From the time he makes contact to the time he gets the home to first time. Stopwatch it. And then that's the bar for, we'll get to it in a minute, championship mode. Now, before we get to championship mode, let's get to the middle 40%. I propose calling it game mode. So we have warm-up mode, game mode, and this is the speed of typical game action. The drill's difficulty level will be that of a typical game. So I propose calling the second segment, the middle 40% of reps, game mode, and then the last 40% championship mode. If you want to go a third, that's fine. You go a third of the reps are warm-up mode, a third of the reps are game mode, a third of the reps are championship mode. And I don't want to get this too confusing, so we want to use simple, easy to follow systems here. You're all busy with your jobs, your business you're running, your other kids. So we want to keep this as usable and as streamlined as possible. And that's part of the reason why I think we should just say warm-up mode, game mode, championship mode. You can just say it, the players will know. After the first time, they'll say, hey, warm-up mode, all right, game mode, all right, championship mode. The players know now. They will have learned that championship mode is faster than typical game action. 110%, 125% game speed. And we'll dive into that championship mode in a second, but you could break it down into thirds. Warm-up mode is a third of the drill. Game mode is a third, and championship mode is a third. Early in the season, you might want to do less championship mode, a little bit more warm-up, and a little bit more than the 40 game mode. The first practice could be 50-50 warm-up mode, game mode. You don't even do championship mode that first practice of ground balls. So there should be progression within the drill, within the practice, but also a progression within the season. And towards the end of the season, you might do a 20% warm-up and a 30% game mode and 50% championship mode. So warm-up mode, progress from 50% game speed to 90%, or 50% game difficulty to a level of about 90% of the typical game in terms of difficulty, challenge, etc. The next 40%, game mode, the speed of a typical game action, the speed of typical game action, the challenge of a typical game. And championship mode, faster or more challenging than your typical game action. On a stopwatch, you might have your team throw it around the bases, 4-corner drill, and you give them 12 seconds. You do that a few rounds, then you do it under 10 seconds, and then you get it under 8 seconds. Now, those seconds are just an example because each level is going to be different, and different teams will have different abilities on that at different times in the season. And so I know we've talked about the 20-40-40 before, but I wanted to propose that, or I wanted to throw it out there that I think that labeling the 3 parts of the drill, warm-up mode, game mode, championship mode, is a good idea in my opinion. See how you can fit that into your practice? Hey, this is warm-up mode. It's going to be a little easier than the game. All right, game mode. Everything here is going to be about game speed. All right, championship mode. We're going faster and tougher than our typical game. And I think by labeling these, we quickly clarify to our players that, hey, warm-up mode is exactly that. It's a warm-up. It's not game speed. Then game speed is telling players this is how fast the typical ground balls come. This is how fast we typically have to make this play to first base. This is how fast the average typical fastball or pitch will be coming in from the opposing pitcher. And then championship mode is, hey, this is the mode we want to play at if we want to win the championship. This is the mode we need to play at if we want to win the championship. And like I said, the difficulty increase can happen at each practice, and it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be exact. It has malleability. These are parameters that I'm throwing out there. And it's also going to happen over the course of the season. So the pitching machine at the end of the season should be throwing the fastballs harder than it was at the beginning of the season, at least a chunk of them. And we have to keep in mind, every team will be a little different. Every player will be a little different. So you have to kind of balance the success versus difficulty ratio. One of the biggest reasons I like warm-up mode, other than the physical on-ramping of the player and their feet and their footwork or their bat speed, and generally speaking, the warm-up of their body, the physical ability to move in those directions and make those plays, swing the bat, make the pitch, field the ground ball, steal second, etc. I like warm-up mode because players should be a lot more successful in warm-up mode. So it builds some confidence. Not only does it build up the player's body to be better prepared when game mode comes around on rep 5 or rep 10 or whatever it is, it gives them a baseline of confidence. At least it should. So it builds up their physical preparedness and their mental confidence. So warm-up mode's great for that. Game mode is a great way to set up drills so they mimic and show players exactly what the game speed or the typical game speed, game difficulty level will be. And then championship mode is just pushing them. And there's going to be a lot more failure in championship mode. Either your practices are easy or your games are easy. You can't have both. The easier your practice, the harder the game. The harder practices, the easier the game. So championship mode should promote failure. It will inherently have a lot more failure. And that's okay. I do think it's important to share with the players like, hey, you're going to fail more in championship mode. And tell them, do you want the game to be easy or practice to be easy? You can only pick one. When it's clarified for players that they can either have an easy practice or an easy game, but they can't have both, of course they're going to start buying into the harder practice. No player would want the game to be harder when their friends are on the other team, when the parents are all there and the scoreboard is on or the lights are on. I don't know any player that's ever said yes to that I've coached. You can say this, I'm going to ask you a question that has 2 answers. You raise your hand for your answer, the one that you would prefer. I'm going to give you 2 choices, players. Raise your hand for the one you want. You want practice to be easy and the game to be hard, or do you want practice to be hard and the games to be easier? You want A, easy practice, hard games, or you want B, hard practice, easier games? Now I'm going to segue into a quote that I heard from a guy, Alex Hormozzi. Some of you might have heard of him. Anyways, he does a podcast and he's really well spoken. He's more into the business world, but he talks about all sorts of things. And I don't know how I came across him over the years. I think it was down the path of my wife has a good friend, and Kate is married to John Lee Dumas. He is the founder of Entrepreneur on Fire. I believe his podcast has like 100 million downloads or more, some crazy amount. I'm sure a handful of you know which podcast I'm talking about. And I think I found it down that path, listening to Entrepreneur on Fire. But nevertheless, Alex had this comment in a recent podcast episode of his that said, habituate to the stressor. Habituate to the stressor. In other words, make it a habit to play at game speed. Make it a habit to play at championship mode. Make it a habit to train like it's a game, because the games are typically a lot more stressful for players. So what he's saying is make it a habit to train at that stressor level. Habituate to the stressor. Make the stressor a habit. And he wasn't tying it into baseball, but I'm trying to tie it here into youth baseball. And I thought, man, that makes a lot of sense. And it ties into, is your practice easy? Well, the games are going to be hard. Get the practice habits to the level of the game stressors, so players have more confidence come game time, and the game stresses them out less because there's not a big increase. There's not a leap or jump up to that level of difficulty. So the stress levels lower when the level of preparation rises. The stress levels of our players lower when the level of their preparation rises. And it's not necessarily having longer practices. It's not necessarily having these long, extended practices that increases our level of preparation. That can be part of it, but at the youth level, I think it's so much more important to focus on scaling up the quality reps during practice and then including reps that are more challenging than the game. Not all of them, of course, but how many more reps can we get that mimic the game, and how can we make those even more challenging to the game when possible? Now, most of those reps that I'm talking about that are more challenging to the game, they don't need to be that much more challenging to the game. It can just be slightly more challenging than the game. That'll do just fine in most cases. They shouldn't be impossible situations or scenarios. And to paraphrase one of those well-known quotes out there by some Navy SEALs, to paraphrase it into baseball, our players won't rise to the level of the competition. They won't rise to the level of the game. They will sink to the level of their training. They'll sink to the level that they practiced at. So our players' stress levels will lower when the level of the preparation rises. Again, this doesn't mean extending and having these long marathon practices. First, start with how many more quality reps you can fit in the 90 minutes, the 2 hours that you already have on the schedule. And then figure out how you can progress and effectively and safely roll into harder, more challenging reps at a minimum towards the end of each drill. All right, I want to finish up with this. So over the last month and a half, I've been helping out coach my daughter's team. She's doing soccer at 7 and 8U. It's youth sports. It's amazing how much similarity there is. And a lot of you coach more than baseball, and you can attest to this, how much similarity there is between sports, as long as they're at a similar level. So if you're like talking like 8U baseball, 8U soccer, 8U volleyball, 8U football, 8U basketball, like 8-year-old, 9-year-old basketball, 7-year-old. Like if you're talking about all the sports at that level, there's so many similarities, even though the sports are different. There's two parts to being a great coach. One, designing a quality practice that gets your players' skills better, their sport-specific skills better, them understanding the game more. And then there's the other part of getting them to hustle, getting them to be better teammates, getting them to be better at receiving feedback, getting them to roll with instructions, getting them to put the team first if need be. So there's not just how much better can we get their swing, or how many more strikes can they throw, or can they play a better shortstop, but there's all those other intangibles that will inevitably serve them better in life when they get older. And so I'm coaching this team, and last Saturday, the other team's coach walks over, nice coach, comes over and says, "Hey, you two are the most positive coaches that we've faced all season." Now, while most of it was going to the coach that I was coaching with, I'm an assistant, not really the head coach on this, but she came over and just said, "Hey, thanks for being such positive coaches." And I asked her, I said, "The other coaches, they're not all like that? Like, have you had some bad experiences?" And she said, "Yeah, we have quite a few." And I'm like, this is 8-year-old, 7-year-old soccer. And she wasn't talking about the other coaches not knowing the game, having their goalie play with a certain technique. She wasn't talking about our team dribbling more or less than it should versus passing or extending it down the field. She was simply just saying how we were handling the players and that they'd had some bad experiences. I said, "That's terrible, but I'll tell you what, the coach that I'm coaching with, his name's Scott. He's impressed the heck out of me. Never coached with him before. gotten to know him a little bit this season, and I've been really impressed with his approach to youth sports. And coming in, I thought, this might be a little bit of a challenge. I didn't want to be the head coach. My first season of soccer, big part of that's because it's not a sport I have a lot of background in. I played from the time I was 5 until the time I was about 12, but I don't think I played a game after 1992 or 1993. And Scott, this coach that I've been coaching with, was eager to coach. He'd done it before. This was his 4th kid. We've talked about this on the podcast of coaching with other coaches, the synergy between coaches. And I'll tell you what, I've been pleasantly surprised with some of the great things he's done, even though it's just 7 and 8-year-old soccer. But to these kids, it's such a big part of their first and second grade years and their childhood. Playing these sports is a big part of it. We have this thing, sports, that now more than ever, in my opinion, is playing a vital role in the positive development of our kids, the young people in our society, in our communities. More than ever, I believe sports is needed. Now more than ever, sports is needed to be that vehicle to prepare our kids, not just for playing high school varsity baseball or college or pro, if all the stars align and that happens for them. But you know what will happen? They'll become an adult. And I think sports may be the best way at this time to prepare our kids for the real world, for becoming an adult, for having a successful life. My wife and I talk about this. If we come across somebody that makes a lot of excuses, kind of into themselves, et cetera, or doesn't take feedback well, my wife or I will ask each other, like if it's somebody she knows or somebody I know, we'll just ask you, hey, they didn't play much sports growing up, did they? And I'll tell you what, we found a very strong connection between the two. Of course, there's definitely some exceptions to that, but I think there's a lot more truth to it than anything. All right, with that said, so here's one thing that the coach that I'm coaching with this season has done or did really well at the beginning of the season, and that is learned every kid's name, almost every kid's name by the end of the first practice, but all of them by the end of the second practice. So within a week, because the first practice was on a Tuesday, the following practice was on a Tuesday. It's just once a week practice. He knew every player's name. That's big. That's big. So when you have 10 or 12 in baseball, most baseball teams have 11, 12, 13 at the youth level, remembering all their names. And the goal should be, how fast can I do it? One is use their names as often as possible. Don't hesitate to ask them again. How about some simple stick-on name tags? First practice. That also helps out their teammates learn their names faster. Having their name tag on, their teammates see their names, have it just a little name tag that sticks on the shirt, maybe even one on the back. I think it's good to put one on the front, one on the back, because a lot of times you can't see the front of their jersey, the front of their practice shirt, right? Say they're in their hitting stance and they're turned sideways to you, or you're standing behind them because you don't want to get hit by the ball. Well, it'd be nice if you had a name tag on front and back. I think that's a good idea. And maybe you do this for the first couple practices. So that was something that he did really well. But there were 8 other things that this coach that I'm coaching with has done really well this season that I want to share with you. And I definitely think some of these are going to be new to some of us in terms of ideas, things that we could work on to do really well, or maybe you're doing a version of it, and I'll give you some examples of what I've seen during the season. So maybe you could just tie it in and intertwine it with what you're already doing. So next week, I'll discuss the 8 things that Coach Scott has done really well this season that I've been able to see firsthand, be right there and watch. Very impressed with 8 things, and hopefully we can get at least 2 or 3 things to add to our tool belt, add to our toolbox. And also next week, I will discuss the 3 goals that I think every coach should have for themselves each season. So I'll share with you the specific 3 goals that I think every youth coach should have each season. So I'll share those 3 goals and those 8 things that Coach Scott did well in next week's episode. And I'll also talk about my tour of Driveline, which is one of the most well-known baseball organizations out there. I'll share my thoughts on my tour that I had last week. I'll share those next week in next week's episode. And until then, let's keep taking care of our health so we can be there to take care of our families, including those great wives and mothers. Happy late Mother's Day shout out to all the baseball moms out there. And let's be there for our family members, our close friends. And let's take this out to the field, the stuff we talked about today. Put it into play. Put it into play. Don't go down looking. Sometimes you just got to reach out and foul off a pitch with 2 strikes. Hey, sometimes you just got to go out and throw this in there and see how it starts off and roll with it. Build from there. It's always great being here with all of you. Send me your emails, coachbo@8020baseball.com. Head over to the website, 8020baseball.com. There's 14 coaching videos, a dozen coaching articles. You can get the drill design guide for free over there. All right. In the meantime, take care of yourself. And until next week, adios.
This has been the 8020 Baseball Masterclass. Take it to the field.